Welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written, a show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. You know the whole deal. Join us as we dive deep into the games you may not know even existed, or maybe you did and you want a deeper dive on that. I am your host, Max, and joining me as always is my co-host, Troy, and working behind the scenes is Jay, to make the sound so much better than it would be if we were to just put it out there. Today's game, we did not announce this at the last episode, and then I had this grossly over-ambitious idea about what we were doing. And now, I don't know that I regret it, but we are also doing this a little bit different now, where going forward, Troy and I will be presenting each other games rather than both of us researching in on a single topic, and hopefully that'll make it a bit more dynamic and surprising. So I am the subject matter expert for this episode, and this episode is about Mage The Ascension, 20th Anniversary Edition. That's neither here nor there. So this is a game of big ideas where reality becomes a battlefield of belief, where your will alone could reshape the world and everything as you know it. It is a role-playing game released by White Wolf Publishing, and it is in line with other games that people may be familiar with. It's usually associated with a trilogy, though it's not really a trilogy, which is Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, and Mage the Ascension. And these are the original games. Let's also ignore the Chronicles of Darkness. That's a whole other nest of things we could talk about, but we're not going to go there. We're not doing that. Let's just focus on this game, because this game is my favorite, personally, of those three. Oh, sorry. I want to make a quick shout out to Changeling.
Oh, yes. Don't forget.
Which is also an intensely ambitious game to get into. More for mindset than anything else. But no, Mage the Ascension is originally published in 1993. Or, sorry, as part of the White Wolf World of Darkness, started in 1991. It was created by Mark Rain Hagen, and later it was led by Philip, I'm going to wreck this, Brusciato. Its design is aimed to revolutionize the magic system in RPGs. Now, quick note about this. The magic system in this game, though it is incredibly unique, and it taps into the world so deeply, is not necessarily innovative in this game. It is more or less borrowed from another game called Ars Magica, which we should also talk about. This is like one of those cans of worms that just, as soon as you get it open, it's like, I can't stop it.
It all bursts out, and it's a rabbit hole that you just sort of fall down.
I know, yeah. I mean, World of Darkness games are like this. It's a horror game fundamentally in the same way as Vampire and Werewolf, if anyone is familiar with those games. The main connecting theme between all three of them, and Changeling as well, and probably some of those other weird games, Mummy, Wraith, Hunter, Demon, those games don't quite hit it as strong as those four, but it's the idea of the tenuous grasp that the player characters have on their humanity. Now, the thing that I personally like about Mage is that rather than in the case of vampires being cursed humans who lose their humanity based on the fact that they have to feed on humans in order to sustain themselves, or werewolves who are spirits of the earth, that I like to call it eco-terrorism, the role-playing game. That's a bit of a glib statement because some of the creatures are supernatural. Anyway, it's R-rated Fern Gully. Anyway, the juice that makes Mage just so, for me personally, so much more interesting is it's the horror of being more human than human. It's about becoming a god and all the terrible things that can happen in that process. So, Troy, you gave this a cursory glance, as we agreed. What was your takeaway from your little dive?
It is an overwhelming book, not in sense of the rules per se. There's some cool rule concepts, and we'll get into that. But the way that it wants you to philosophically look at concepts like magic, self, change, and the world around you are really big and kind of like, whoa, we're diving into stuff here in this game that is not just like play. We're having like thoughtful conversations now. What's happening? So it's got some really cool stuff to it. In terms of the set of the four, Mage and Changeling definitely appeal to me the most too, as like kind of the weird ones, as it were.
Yep.
But, I think this is a really cool one. And there are really neat twists on it that I've never engaged with that I really want to know more about, like Dark Ages Mage, you know what I mean? Like some of the weird other like offshoots of this are really interesting just because of the way this approaches magic, where it's not like these rigid spell lists that we're so familiar with, right?
Yeah, we'll totally get into that. Yeah, and again, it's not to say that vampire or werewolf are lesser in any way.
No.
I do not believe that. I've had a lot of fun. The first White Wolf game I ever got into was Vampire, and I had a great time playing that. And that is more of like a social political game. It is sort of the higher echelons of that are very... It's a game that... I have mixed feelings about LARPing, but it's a game that lends itself to that very well.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this game is, you want to set that tone about what people think is going on. And then it's about people kind of deciding on the truth of that statement. And I know that sounds very heady, and it kind of is. And that might be one of the reasons why it's hard to get into. Just a quick rundown of the edition history and the material itself. So first edition came out basically forming those main concepts. Then you get a second edition, which refined a lot of that. You then got some expansions so there's an entire internal lore, like all White Wolf World of Darkness games. The crucial offset point was the Sorcerer Crusade. So that book came out in 1998. And that's sort of like the 15th century source book. And then they came up with Dark Ages, probably because they came up with the Vampire Dark Ages one. And I think there's a Werewolf one too. For some reason, that became a popular thing in the White Wolf line at some point.
Cthulhu even did it.
Yeah, exactly. So like, and then there's the 20th anniversary edition, which kind of takes the best of, not all of those, but a lot of them. Oh, there's the revised edition. So that kind of it's got a darker tone. It plays up one of the other factions, one of the really interesting, I would say all the factions are very interesting, but yeah. Anyway, this book is, if you pick it up, I am tempted to get a hard copy of it, like right now. It is gorgeous. It takes all the good looks of the previous editions, but then it adds this refinement, and it's almost Art Nouveau. It's got these nice borderings. Like all of their books, they've got great font, header, spacing. It's double columned. The art it's a lot more consistent in this edition than, say, in the first. And this is true of a lot of old White Wolf books, and frankly, a lot of starting role-playing games from that era. The art is a little bit, you kind of just made do with what you got and who you knew. So the quality, it's very of a time and very mixed. But this edition basically is like, it's a best of in the best possible way. It also integrates a lot of the concepts and things that the other editions kind of added in through splat books and other modules. Yeah, it's gorgeous. It's got the purple cover on it with a variation on the magician card in the tarot. Oh, that's another thing about this game. It goes out of its way to integrate quote unquote real magic concepts into the game. And by that, I mean, not to be pretentious, magic spelt with a CK at the end.
Right.
It plays with that idea of esotericism in history, and then it ties it into the game. So yeah, like, and it's a giant book. It's like 600 plus pages. You're getting a tome.
Yeah, it was a massive book, and it's kind of like, I don't know if you want to call it this, but it's like 3 sub books too, right?
essentially, it is 3 books put together.
Yeah.
That kind of add complexity to the game. So, like, to get started, you only have to read the first one to get basic concepts, characters, and most of that other stuff. And then the other 2 books add a lot more depth. And I would argue probably are more for the storyteller, which is their equivalent to the GM. Yeah, it's a beast. And Troy, you were mentioning before we started the show that like Legend of the Five Rings, some editions more than others, there's this intimidating level of investment.
Yeah, that's right.
And of all of the White Wolf games, I'd actually say Mage is maybe the worst for this.
There is a level of understanding that's required from the storyteller that goes beyond some of the expectations of your traditional dungeon master or lore keeper, or you know what I'm trying to say. Your game master archetype. And one thing we did note was in a game like L5R, Legend of the Five Rings, both your game master and your player base need to have a shared understanding for that world to click, because your players have to be able to behave appropriately within the confines of the setting, as well as the game master creating those confines believably. I find, and what Max has pointed out to me, and I agree with this, is in the Ascension here, you can start with less understanding of the setting and kind of have the storyteller broaden your mind as you're sort of role-playing that experience of a character, learning about how this all works. You, the player, can share that with them in a way that encourages a newer player to engage with it. But once you bite in, you do have to make a commitment. It's not one of those role-playing games where you cannot know how it works and the GM just does all the stuff and says, roll this now, and you do that. Like, you have to really commit to this game in a way that's more investing or requires more investment. But it's really intriguing. It doesn't propose to you the same type of scenarios or thought experiments or problems that you're going to find in like 99% of other games. And I haven't actually played a campaign of this yet, but I'm really interested to explore what this game does because it challenges your expectations. And I think that's one of the things I look for in a game.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think a good indicator of that for this game is that it has a lexicon of terms that come close to the glossary in the back of like a Dune novel.
Right.
And you don't need to know all of those things as a player. And even maybe as a GM, you might, I mean, it makes the world feel more real if you know how to use the language of the world itself, especially if you're bringing people, whatever their characters are, bringing the Awakened into the world of, you know, the magical societies that exist. Yeah, you're right. You can cold start players. There's even a factional start for the game, which is, they're called orphans, which are basically Awakened, is another term for mage, is the proper term, where the Awakened characters, they just have reached that state. They're not part of any organization, or if they are, they're just being brought into it initially. And even if you did a traditions start, or God help you, a technocracy start that did that as well, it'd still be possible. But you could also do it where it's like, hey, these group of people have discovered that they have powers and consciousness that expands beyond normal humans, and they've somehow found each other. And then you can gradually build in the idea that, okay, then there are these other groups, and you might have to choose a group, and there's this war that's happening, and so on and so forth. Before we get too deep into the lore, let's pay some important points to how the game functions. And in many ways, this is going to explain how a lot of White Wolf World of Darkness games work. It's most important to know that like all of these games are super lore heavy, if we haven't said that already, but to the point where they have like, I want to say like 1/5 to 1/4 of all of the books are just short stories from the POV of some character in universe. And they're actually pretty well written, or at least they serve the purpose of explaining that world in a way that makes it a little easier to get. Doesn't mean that people should need to read them. I like to think of it as a multi-pronged approach that World of Darkness books are really good at doing, which is I got the mechanical rules, I have the academic explanation, and I also got a little story that tells you how all of that works. And if you kind of work your way through all three of those, I find it settles up in the brain better, especially for something that's so dense. So anyway, just to the storyteller system mechanics then. Let's start there.
And these are the core mechanics. And would you describe this as applying across the core 4 games in general, or do they get changed significantly between these games?
The main system for determining success, the primary arbitration system, is the same.
Cool.
It is a D10 based system, and it uses pools. For those that don't know what a pool system is, that is when instead of adding numerical modifiers to a single die roll, the points that you have in an ability are the number of dice that you roll. And there's something nice and intuitive about that, especially for people who don't want to focus so much on the math. Now, that's not to say that this is a rules-light game. There is actually quite a decent amount of crunch in it. And there's a lot of different ways you can swing it, but it does use big chunks of things. So it uses, all right, let me just explain the backbone of the system itself. So all characters in World of Darkness, whether they be vampires, werewolves, mages, changelings, and the half dozen or so other things that they could be, including just ordinary people, statistically operate on an attribute and ability system. The attributes are broken down into 3 categories. And this is going to sound super technical. I'm trying to make this not sound super technical. It breaks it into 3 categories: physical, mental, and social. Which, interestingly enough, I remember talking to a psychiatrist once and describing that to them, and then they actually said that is a framework that some models of psychiatry use. And these, with some exceptions, but are generally measured between 1 and 5 points. You can't have 0 in something unless there's a very good reason for it. And you typically don't have more than 5. Then, below that, you have abilities, which are more like learned or practicable things. So these are like, in other games, we might call them skills or knowledges or things like that.
Right.
They're ranked a little bit differently. They are also broken into 3 categories. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention about attributes, that each of those 3 categories has 3 separate stats in them. So there's 9 core attributes. Then there's abilities. Those abilities are broken up into other things, which are essentially break down into innate abilities, skills that require some kind of expertise, and then knowledge effectively. Sorry, for some reason I didn't make a note about what they're specifically called, but that is more or less how they break down.
Now, when you want to resolve your check, what is it based off of? Because you have attributes, you have abilities. Are you assembling them, or are you contrasting them and getting a value between them, or what's the math?
So very simply, what you do is a problem is either proposed by the storyteller or some kind of feat is thought up by the player.
Right. From
that, the storyteller then determines which attribute and ability would come into play. A good example of this would be you're trying to convince somebody to give you something. So you might use, let's say, manipulation as an ability. And you might pair that with, let's see, say you were trying to convince somebody that you knew something. We'll say something legal. So you'd pair manipulation and law. I imagine if a character were a lawyer, they might use that a lot. And so what you do is you take the sum total of both of those points and you roll that many d10s. Now, the difficulty of that roll is set to a scale based on what the GM says. So it runs between 2 and 10 on the die. And this is mainly because 1 is the botch.
Right.
And I'll explain that in a sec. But usually it's around 6 as a standard difficulty. And then, like, you got to remember that this game uses very large jumps in its math. So a 6 and a 7 is a significant jump. And then what you do is you roll all your dice, and the ones that get above that difficulty rating are passes or successes, and the ones that go under that don't count for anything. Now, any ones that are rolled negate a success.
Right. They cancel it out.
And if there's a deficit at the end, that's very bad.
Is that the equivalent to rolling a 1 on a d20 effectively?
Yes. And it really depending on what you're doing, but it basically blows up in your face. So that's your catastrophic failure. Okay, if we have a system for missing horribly, in the way that, like, if we lose all of our successes and in fact get, like, accumulate failures, how do we get, like, where's our criticals come from? Well, that has to do with how many successes you actually get.
Oh, okay.
One success means you squeak it over the line, right? There may be some consequences for not fully carrying it out, but you do. I guess a good example of this is you pick the lock, but you kind of break it. And so now it can't be, someone looks at that lock, they're going to know that you've messed with it.
Yes, of course. Okay, cool.
You got what you wanted, but at a cost. 2 successes is usually your safe, normal thing. And then if you get 3 or above, now you're starting to get, like, a measurably increased level of success. And if you get over 5, that's basically a crit. I've seen some people count 4 as being close enough to that. But that's the nice thing about this game as compared to a pass-fail system that might exist in Dungeons & Dragons, is that it has degrees of success.
Yes.
And it's not the only system to do this, but it's the first one I ever ran into.
I love gradients of success. They're so cool.
Yeah, well, it just, especially for a game that's so focused on storytelling, it tells you so much more about what just happened outside of the control or narrative fiat of player or GM.
Yes, of course. Agreed.
And I think there's a place for that, but I always like the idea that the third storyteller in the game is random chance. There are some actions that go beyond making a single roll. There are extended rolls and those extended rolls might actually require different combinations of skills. So, like, say you were, like, disarming a bomb, you might have to use some knowledge of, like, electrical systems or technology.
Right.
But then you might have to have something about reaction speed or how careful you are dexterously in order to manipulate the outcome. Generally, you put an extended roll on something you want bigger stakes. And then lastly, there's a contested roll. So if 2 characters are trying to do something where they're trying to aim for inverse results, the classic one to this is 2 people on either side of a door. One of them's trying to get in, one trying to keep the other person out.
Would this also apply to, like, a race?
It could. I don't think it would apply to a race in every sense. I think it's if the checks are directly opposed.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
If you were racing somebody, or if it were like a chase sequence or something equivalent to that, you're individually handling obstacles or difficulties as you go. Unless, of course, you want to abstract the entire race into a single roll.
Right. Okay.
Or possibly an extended roll. Then you might see it as an opposed check. But I think the door scenario is probably the best one that I can think of. So that it's basically somebody's trying to force their way in. You're trying to keep them out. You both roll your appropriate, I suppose it would be strength on both parts, and athletics would be the paired talent. Oh, sorry, I have them. The 3 ability categories are talents, skills, and knowledges. And they are as I described them before. Talent is something that you could get better at, but you just kind of know. Skill is something that you would have to learn. And knowledge is also something you'd have to learn, but it's more abstract. It's not like a doing thing. It's more of a saying thing. That's essentially the core function or the core resolution system for the game.
And with that resolution system, you're doing your spot checks, you're handling opposed or contested rolls. Is combat basically an extrapolation of those mechanics into sort of like a fight? Or is combat like a third wheel that works differently?
No, it effectively works off of that with combat-specific spot rules. So there are things to consider like, say, range of a target or cover. Again, when we're talking about range combat, or if we're brawling, there might be counter step and block and certain parries. There are, in fact, separate modules for a lot of these games that expand on combat systems or expand on weapons specifically. This edition covers a lot of those things. Despite this being a huge book, that is essentially a compendium of all versions of the game with updates and sort of reinterpretations. There is still a book that expands this book, believe it or not. The two books that, one of them, I always call them helpful aids to playing the game, especially for this edition, are Book of Secrets, which is essentially the stuff that didn't make it into the main adaptation of Mage 20th Anniversary Edition.
Oh, but it's stuff from the prior editions.
Yeah, it's like the little bits and pieces from the prior editions that weren't core, but actually are really interesting and explain a lot more about the world and the setting and all this other stuff. And then this is great because I don't know of another World of Darkness book that has this book, which is M20, How Do You Do That? Is literally the title. And it is basically a deeper explanation of this magic system, because that seems to be the hardest thing for people to grok.
Right.
If they're used to a traditional magic system. Oh, I will say character creation is very customizable. I won't get into too much depth with it because I don't want to eat up too much time, because I want this to be about Mage and not necessarily about World of Darkness. Essentially, you're allocated a number of points per section. So you basically choose best, middle, and weakest of those categories. So physical, social, mental, and then you distribute a number of points between each of the attributes and abilities associated with the category. So it's a point allocation system, not a point buy system. That would be different.
And it's kind of broken down into these concepts and identities, and you're picking your way through your options. There's an optional faction choice you can make, which I think is not that optional, really. You know, I actually may agree, but it feels pretty important to know, unless you're going with the orphan origin point, like what's going to happen.
It's more optional in this version than any other version I've seen, where it was much more defaultive, and you were, especially with like the first editions, and this is true of Vampire and Werewolf, you're kind of slotted into the sort of, this is the wrong term for it, but good guy role.
Right.
The more benevolent of these. And so in case of Mage, this is what is the traditions. It's also important to note at the top of the sheet, your character sheet, you've got name, your character's name, player, your player's name. So put your name on stuff. Chronicle, that's just the name of the campaign. Then you've got some other fun things. So you've got nature and demeanor. Now, this is something in the original World of Darkness is kind of pervasive through the whole game, and it has a lot of interesting implications, rule-wise and role-playing-wise. So, and this is also another thing that I find is hard to get people to grasp the concept of. So, nature is who you really are, and this could be described in a word like jealous or ambitious, usually some kind of descriptive word that describes a personality state. So nature is who you really are, and demeanor is who you would like to be seen as being. And that also uses a word. And these are kind of like little prompts, and there are benefits to things like willpower, which hopefully I'll have enough time to get into, where it's essentially how to push yourself, and there's a mechanical feedback there that is a risk reward that encourages role play toward your character type. And then there are affiliations and sects, and you have your essence, and this, my God, there's just so many things in this. Like, if people are interested in me talking more about this game, we can do another episode about it, because I don't think I'm going to really scratch the surface here. So the magic system, which is the thing that makes Mage the unique thing, though in all the other games, characters have powers. They're sometimes called disciplines or totems or various other things. In Mage, they are called spheres. And they are much like attributes and abilities, except they govern aspects of reality, for lack of a better word. Again, this is something that's taken or adapted from Ars Magica, which is an older version of the same idea. The Ars Magica does it a little differently. So I'll name out those spheres. So you have correspondence, entropy, force, life, matter, mind, prime, spirit, time. Now, some of those might sound familiar. Some of those might not.
Yeah, there's some like elemental edge to it, but then there's some much more abstract concepts in there too.
Yeah, and some of them are taken from the sort of like real world esotericism, like correspondence. which is, for example, the connection and relationship between things.
Oh.
It might be useful if you wanted to, I don't know, teleport. But I'll get into that. So, you're an awakened, a mage. You have powers. How do they work? Well, in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, you would have a list of spells, and if you're using a Vancian system, you'd be able to use these, and then for some reason you forget them because it's how the magic works. Or in other systems, you might have a spell point system where you have mana or MP or some other magic point, and you spend those until you run out, and when you rest, you regain it. This is a little closer to that, but there's a major difference in that. I'm going to make a statement that's not exactly true, but will boldly make the point. There are no concrete spells in this game. Again, not exactly true. But what players do is they say what they would like to do, much like the way that they would do with a skill check, except now we're bending the game itself and we're warping reality down to its core. So I don't say I cast Fireball. I say, oh, we're in danger. I want to tear open this wall so we can walk into the next room, right? There's no spell for that. I'm just saying what I want to do to reality in a way that reality wouldn't normally allow me to do.
Yeah, it's like you input the glitch that you need to proceed.
Right. And so much like the same way that other roles are determined, what you do is the GM takes that and interprets that by using one of the spheres. And sometimes that can actually be paired with a skill, or it can be paired with another sphere to create a pool. Now, when you pair spheres together, there's some complication because it's, I think if I remember correctly, it's more based on the averages than the additives because magic is hard. In the example that I give, if I was the storyteller in that situation and somebody wanted to tear open a wall with their bare hands as if it were a piece of paper, I would basically say, well, that sounds like matter. So I'm going to need you to roll matter. There's also the core power of a mage. How awakened are you? Other World of Darkness games have this. I think Vampire calls theirs potency. In mage, it's arete, which is essentially how ascended are you?
Oh, yeah.
Someone with one arete is basically just newly awakened and doesn't know the upper umbral plane from the lower umbral plane. Sorry, that's a joke for anybody who gets the game. And if you were 10 points in, then you would essentially be ascended. There's some argument as to whether that's true or not. So you take whatever your sphere that you're manipulating, you take your arete, you measure that against what is called quintessence, which is essentially like magic points, but it's got a weirder twist to it.
Oh.
So you expend a certain amount of that and you manipulate. You tear the wall open like a piece of paper, just as you described it, or however you want to do it. You know, like I want to point my hand at the wall and disassemble it brick by brick. And then when we walk through, it reassembles. Now, that sounds fine and dandy, but then you're probably asking yourself the question, well, if mages have this crazy amount of power, then how is it that they're just like not flying around shooting lightning and blasting each other into the ether?
Right.
This is where the setting starts coming in. And this is kind of the neat thing that makes it not just a cool system, but a cool world. The world that Mage occupies is one where reality is set up in a certain way. And this is going to play into the factions that involve the game. So the players are playing the Awakened, while everyone else are sleepers. And they are people who conform to this thing called consensus reality, which is people don't fly, people can't shoot lightning out of their hands, you can't open a portal to hell, and a dozen other things that would defy reality. And they are magical, but in a way where consensus and normality is their normal state. So when a mage decides, I'm going to, Harry Potter style make this car fly, and an ordinary person sees that, there's a cognitive dissonance that not only happens in the sleeper, but it actually ripples through reality and then punches the mage in the face.
So this is an interesting question here. It's kind of like the film The Matrix, but arcane.
It's funny because this obviously came out before that. But yes, The Matrix is like a cyberpunk version of this.
Yeah, yeah.
But then there's so many, like there's even equivalents to some of the factions in the Matrix that are very similar to the factions in this game.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. Well, it's that idea that there are people that are awake and there are people who are asleep. And it's not that there's like 10 people who are asleep who are dangerous to you. It's kind of like the ancient concept where any of the sleepers could be dangerous, similar to with paradoxes, where if any sleeper is to see you or witness your magic, it could cause a lot of damage to you.
Yeah, well, so there's this whiplash effect that can happen if your magic is too vulgar, is the term.
Ah, okay.
And it is called paradox. And paradox is more like a force of nature, but it does originate through sleepers. And it's basically the universe detecting a glitch that should not exist. And then it corrects that. In the most mildest terms, just taking the power away from the spell. And in the worst terms, causing a fault in reality that punishes the mage that did it. So blowing up, like causing the thing to explode.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I tend to when I'm storytelling this, I tend to like the idea that it's trying to forcibly go back to what is normal. So my favorite way to punish a mage in an extreme way with paradox is to punch them out into another plane of reality.
Oh.
So it's like, no, you can't be here, and then you get shot off to another plane. And now you're kind of trapped in another sort of some kind of netherworld where you have to, either it's a timeout box where you will pop back in, or you might have to force your way out.
Okay. So that's really interesting. So the relationship between what happens with the paradox is really GM driven as opposed to being a really set in stone mechanical outcome.
Yeah, it's a lot like the way the magic system works. The players determine the exact thing that they want the spell to do. Mm-hmm. There's a great piece of art that's actually in the version of, really evocative piece of art in the Chronicle of Darkness version of Mage, which I will not talk about here. But it's a woman holding onto a cob of corn right in front of her face as the kernels then turn into bees.
That's wild.
Yeah. And so the less vulgar your magic is, the more likely you're going to pull it off. Like if you can make your spell seem like coincidence, you're all good. Like an example they give in the book is, say somebody needs something, like say they lost their keys to get into their house, and you reach in your bag and you say, oh, hey, actually I have your keys right here. Well, you made those keys in that bag, but nobody saw that. And it's possible that maybe you grabbed their keys and forgot about it. And it has to do with that plausibility.
That's interesting. So it's almost like, how close to the chest can you bluff?
Yeah. And it comes down to this kind of a bit of a gaming the system between the storyteller and the player as to what could I get away with. As I said, there are other planes of reality in this game where you could get away with vulgar magic all day.
Right.
In fact, in some of those planes, some of those spells might work even better than they would normally. But you can't affect the real world in another dimension. Well, you can, but you can only affect certain aspects of it, and it's much more removed. And again, if it sounds like I'm like hinting around these things, it's because I would have to explain chantries and the Umbra and all of these other like dimensional realities. And I just don't have time for that. Like we're already pushing like 3/4 into our episode.
Well, at that landmark then, let's hit some of the lore in more detail, what you can tell us about, because we've kind of done a brief overview of how the core system works, what you can do with character creation, and sort of what sets magic apart. But all that is really dependent on the setting this game comes from. So how does that work? Okay, so where would you like me to start? Okay, because I know that factions are a part of character creation, and we didn't touch on it there.
Sure.
So what are some of the factions you pick when you are being a player character?
So there are 4 main factions, and they break down into subsets, like departments. Well, 2 of them do mainly. 2 of them, you might think of them as ideological factions, and the other 2 are factions of circumstance. is like how I would like to put it. So the two main ideological factions, the head-to-head of the game, are the Council of Nine Mystic Traditions, which is magic as we kind of imagine it, and some of how we might not. And these are like, somebody who's got the spookiness about them. They're really into Freemasonry, or they're really religious, like in a Christian sense or in a Judaic sense or whatever. Or they might be more shamanistic. It also categorizes some things that are like mad scientists.
Oh, okay. So it's got
free thinkers. Yeah.
Interesting. So all these different like thought paradigms are under this umbrella then.
Yeah, and so those would be the 9 traditions. And that's the fun thing about choosing the default setting or the default faction, is that you get a lot of flavors to play with. You can choose everything from, hermetic magicians that kind of play off of like Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and all that fun stuff. But you can also play like cyber wizards, people like hackers, I think is a good way to describe it.
Like magical hackers. That's because that's one of the examples given of a good non-vulgar use of magic, is like you can be typing away in the computer when you just use magic to do something and it looks like you've hacked it, but you haven't.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's actually a perfect segue into the opposing faction. And again, this is sort of the ideological concept. And the fun thing about this game, and this is just a fun thing about White Wolf games in general, is that they actually have source books for playing the opposing faction. And playing the opposing faction in this game is a big conceptual ask from your players. But if they're willing to go in on it, it's a lot of fun. The Technocratic Union is the opposing force, or more shortly referred to as the Technocracy. And they are the engineers of consensus reality, at least historically. And I'm trying to think of a way to describe this. They're born out of Enlightenment thinking. They're rationalistic in their mindset, but they use magic. They have access to all the same spheres, and it's a matter of perspective that separates them. The 9 traditions are like, oh, well, we're using traditional magic, the way that you would imagine it, or somewhat less traditional, but certainly subversive, like it's questioning reality. Whereas the Technocracy's use of magic, which they would never call it that, they would call it like reality manifestation or some more sciencey sounding word. They use the same spheres, but they call them different things, and they have, in one way, an advantage because they are on the side of consensus, because in some respect, in the lore of the world, they built it.
Ah, okay.
But they also, I don't know if exactly the right term to say this, they have to lie to themselves that what they're doing is science.
But they know it's not. They know it's magic. Or do they?
They don't.
Okay.
No, they don't. And that's the weird ask.
Okay.
When you're trying to get, it's like, this is how you do advanced play in this game, is you play the bad guys.
Right.
Because I'm trying to think of like a good metaphor for how they operate. So you could say they're like the agents in the Matrix, but the agents in the Matrix are part of the Matrix, and that's not really what's going on here. These are people who are just really believe in consensus reality, so much so that that's just how they think about things. But they're more like people who are like, at the moment I can't remember how they subdivide, but they also have departments.
Oh, snap. Okay.
One form is, you might think of them like the Men in Black, right? Like the people that show up to, fix the problem. They usually serve, if not as part of a government organization, then as the organization itself.
Okay.
Or like the people really running the show.
So they got like a G-Man vibe to them?
They can, yep. They also don't always agree even internally, because their different departments have different, we'll call them initiatives. There's one that is like the social character, and I've always thought that a fun Technocracy character to play from that department, which unfortunately fails to come to me at the moment, would be to play like a Tony Robbins style motivational speaker. But his social abilities actually alter reality. He doesn't think he's doing it that way. He believes in the power of human will.
But it's magic.
He believes that you can tap into yourself and become whatever you want. Or it's kind of like The Secret.
Yeah.
Like, you know that, right? That's more of the mindset of technocracy. Or they are actual engineers that use gadgetry to lie to themselves. Again, lie not really even the right word. It's more of a matter of perspective. I don't want to make it seem like the traditions have the correct point of view, because that's the whole point of the game. It's these two different clashing ideas about what Ascension is, how do you get it, and what is reality supposed to look like. And that's the dynamic there. It's people who use super science, but it's actually just their willpower. Like, my favorite thing is it's like, oh yeah, I created a device that can actually teleport us from one place to another. And then the other members of the paradox within the technocracy is, why doesn't it work when I do it?
Oh, that is interesting.
Because it's that inventor's will and understanding of that device that makes it work, not the device.
Yeah.
It may have entirely functional parts and stuff that makes perfect sense to everyone that they explain it to, and that makes it work better because it plays into consensus reality, but it's still that guy or that gal or whoever might be messing around with it.
In a way, it's like the circle loops back around on itself and their technology becomes magic.
Yeah, but it still operates on the same underlying principles of willpower and the ascendedness of the person, so arete. But in their mind, they're thinking about it more as like, how close to perfect human can I be, as opposed to how close to God could I be?
Interesting. I love that there's not a correct path. It's more just these two very wickedly divergent ideas on what to do with this power.
Yeah. And like in the age of philosopher kings, like in the antiquity and all that, the traditional mages, I mean, the technocratic rational mages didn't even exist. But because local pockets of people didn't have a shared consensus reality, these philosopher king mages could do whatever they wanted with their power. They could, turn stuff inside out and alter the world and raise a golden city if they wanted. And then as you get into the Enlightenment, there's basically this group of people that come together and they're like, this is dangerous. We need safeguards. We can't just let anybody go nuts and change reality. And that's the thing that I love about this game is that that's why it's wrong to say the bad guys, but the technocracy, they have a point.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
The traditions, they want to hold on to their power and the things that are theirs, but the technocracy sees that as unsafe. Like you're messing with reality. And I am trying to protect reality, but I need to get into the other two factions.
Yeah.
And it's super hard to describe them as factions. As I said, they are factions of circumstance, not factions of ideology.
Yes.
Like the traditions and the technocracy. So we'll start with the Marauders first. Actually, technically there's a fifth one, but that would be the Orphans or Disparates, which are kind of like the leftovers. But we'll get into the big ones. So the Marauders, I'll lay these two out as opposition to each other, because that might be a good way to think about it. Marauders and Nefendi. So this is another dynamic. So Marauders are what happens to an awakened when they don't get the proper guidance early on. It doesn't necessarily have to happen at the beginning of their existence. People can become Nefendi people can become Marauders over time. But the most common version of a Marauder is somebody that didn't get the proper discipline and has the power. And effectively, what characterizes them is they live in their own reality, which they have no regard for anybody else. And their naivete allows them to buck consensus reality in a way that other people can't. These people, as characters, are generally really amazing cult leaders. Or another good example or a character that I used in one game was this hippie girl who found her awakening spaced out on acid, and she basically lives in a permanent acid trip, wandering up and down Haight Street in San Francisco, and anybody that gets near her gets trapped in that acid reality.
That's wild.
So these are people that don't play by the rules because they don't know what they are. And they're so caught up in their own headspace that they're basically insane. Okay, so that's the Marauders. Now, on the other side of that spectrum are the Nefendi. And this, again, it can happen at the beginning of a awakening, but the archetypical way is to imagine it more at the end. And it's misanthropic people who have pushed to the edge of reality so much that they realize, or at least believe, that there is nothing. And my favorite way that one of the books describes it, or it's described in various places, these awakened exist as if their soul was torn out, turned around backwards, and shoved back in. Everything they see looks like a twisted mistake to them. And from everyone else's point of view, they are the twisted mistake. They're basically magic psychopaths.
Oh.
The one sharing value that they have is that reality is a mistake and should be undone. They're not reckless in the way that the Marauders would be, because they just don't know or care that reality has consensus. They deliberately want to undermine any interpretation of reality. They want to unmake the world.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, so they want to do maximum damage.
Yeah, and they're more of your Machiavellian villain.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that the other thing that connects Marauders and Nefendi together is that they generally don't work well with others, but they can.
Right.
The Marauder is somebody that you might encounter randomly and be like, oh shit. Like, even the traditions think that that's a problem, because like either it's going to give us away, or it's just causing too much chaos, and like we can't cast our own spells and stuff around them. Obviously, the Technocracy thinks they're a huge problem.
Yes.
The Nefendi might think that the Marauder is kind of just helping the problem.
Right. It's just
by causing as much chaos as possible.
Spread that fire around, guys.
Yeah, but the Nefendi could also be somebody who's pretending to be a technocrat or pretending to be a traditionalist. Like, they could be the infiltrator, the one that's trying to undermine everything.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because they're way more, like, they're tortured by reality itself, but they're fully aware of, in fact, you might argue they're too aware of the situation. And that's partly why they're the way they are.
Yes.
Again, we're kind of running to the end here, but like that's the dynamic of this game. That's why I think this game is so amazing. And there's so many other things like avatars, which are like the magical soul of yourself that exists outside of yourself. And it's like,
oh, it's like your stand.
It's like your version of your character that you could talk to, but it's also part of you. And it's the thing that goes into other dimensions if you're astral projecting. There's all the dimensions and realities, and some of them are ones made entirely up of concepts, and some of them are made up of like death and memories. There's chantries, which are sort of like they're magical spaces, like safe houses, essentially. And every faction gets their version of them. I think the Technocracy calls them constructs, and the Nefendi calls them labyrinths. And I don't know if the Marauders don't have terms for things. They call it whatever they feel like. It's my scoopity bloop. But it's basically a TARDIS.
Right.
Or it can be. Where it's like, oh, it's that weird Victorian house on the hill. And when you go inside, it's like way bigger than it should be on the inside. And it's a safe place to do magic and to protect. And it's also usually on a ley line, which is a magic, or what is it? It's like a focal point. And that may be something that other factions might want. So there's an element of territorial control in the game that you can make a focal point. So it's like, yeah, we have our chantry and we're practicing our traditions. And then the Technocracy wants to cap our base. And then it turns into a siege, a magical siege. And you're like, oh shit, they've got like a SWAT team at the door, but they're also penetrating through another form of reality into this house.
That's cool.
I'm trying to think of like some media analogs. If you want just a surfacey, flash, kind of fun way of thinking about it, there was an animated... Do you remember when Lionsgate Films put out a bunch of Marvel animated stuff?
Oh.
Like, they had a bunch of Marvel animated movies.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I do remember this.
Yeah. Like, there was a little time where they must have had some deal with Marvel. I think this may have been before Disney bought it.
Yeah.
Or at least it crosses that timeline. But there's one for Doctor Strange, and the way that that plot plays out in the mages, that's the flashy glam rock version of Mage. There's also a subtler, more psychological way to play it, where it's more about those big concepts, and you're tapping into reality. You're going on adventures into like conceptual space.
How does it track with Constantine as another setting reference?
Not at all.
Not at all.
I guess, well, I mean, you could play that. Constantine is more like a game called Hunter.
Oh, okay. So it's like that would, if you wanted that type of fantasy or character, you would look at one of the adjacent games.
Just a hot point. The World of Darkness version of Hunter is, I'll be controversial and call it hot trash. But the Chronicle of Darkness, Hunter the Vigil, is the best thing to have come out of that production line. And it's like one of the last things. And I'm including things like Slasher as well, which is just bizarre. But anyway, that's a total side note. But yes, if you wanted to do Constantine, you would probably play Hunter.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, just curious about that because I don't know why. John Constantine's cool.
Yeah. I mean, there's some aspects of that kind of overlap. Like there's the dimensional travel in the Constantine movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's some of the ritual aspects of like using charms and focal objects in order to channel stuff. So yeah, I would say that there's trappings of that. There's also that weird movie that came out, which I think was somebody trying to cash in on the Mage idea after the Underworld movies came out. And I'm trying to remember what it's called right now.
Oh, I remember Underworld movies. Yeah.
But yeah, there was another movie that came out that was about like teenagers with magic powers.
Oh.
And it was basically, it seemed like Mage. Like if anybody out there can remember the name of that movie, that's not that. As I said, this game is flexible enough that you could cater to a lot of different styles of play. That's sort of like the bastardized Hollywood version of what Mage might be like.
Right.
But no, it's a good game. It's got a lot of depth. And yeah, I only scratched the surface here, frankly. And I could say that about a lot of the World of Darkness games. I mean, we could talk about other ones. In fact, I'm fully planning to talk about Vampire, Werewolf, Changeling. I mean, we can get into those. There's one amazingly underrated White Wolf game called Orpheus. And it doesn't have a lot of legs, but for what it is, it does it very well. So we can cover that at some point. And probably nobody remembers that game. And again, there's Exalted and Scion, and if nothing else, they are prolific with their output.
Yeah, 100%.
The quality may vary a lot, but yeah. So yeah, that is Mage the Ascension. Any last thoughts on your part?
My takeaway is it does what I like out of a magic system, where it's not about min-maxing or memorizing powers. It's about expressing character intent in the world with a totally unique set of verbs and powers, right? And that's what this nails. Like this did it first, did it best, or maybe not first, like because there's ours, but it's right in that style of magical power, and it really attracted me. I think the setting and the lore is really interesting and does not map very easily to other fiction, like you were saying. There's not a lot of other things that you can super easily grab onto and say, oh, this is like Mage. You kind of need to test it out and see if you like it for itself.
Yeah, exactly. And as with any game, it's a toolbox of ideas, and you can't do it wrong so long as everybody's having a good time.
Hey, that's true.
So that is our episode on Mage the Ascension. Next episode, to play off of this one, so maybe we can get into this, but I think we're going to go a little broader, is on magic systems in role-playing games. So that is our Beyond the Book.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Until then, happy gaming and have a great one.
Have a great one, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.